Okay, if we could ask everyone to please take a seat, we'll make a start to today's proceedings. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان. We are here today gathered for a very significant event. Many people have been intrigued and interested by seeing the title, and that's not just here in Exeter, that's far and wide where people have seen this poster. And I can explain why in just a moment. And before that, I'd just like to say, and perhaps speak to the concerns of many of us in the room today, that wherever we look around the world, or whichever day turns to another day, we are presented with another affliction, more anxieties, more problems around the world, including we can see what's erupted in Iran also, and of course Palestine, which we addressed in the last talk that we had here in the Mosque. This is the second of that series, and the least we can do when we are all affected in this way is at least come together, talk about these things, have discussions. Sometimes we cannot overcome these injustices. It's not within our powers from the point of an Islamic tradition. We know that the Prophet ﷺ said, if you see something bad, an evil, a wrong happening in front of you, then stop it with the hand. And if you are not able, then express it with the tongue. And if you cannot even do that, then at least in the heart, you should feel that such a thing is reprehensible. And that's the lowest grade of our iman and our faith. So the lowest, or the least and the minimum we can do is at least come together here and express that reprehensibility, that anxiety, what is in our hearts about these issues. Today's talk connects to the last one, and it's about centers on Kashmir, and there will be something also about its connection to Palestine. And we thought this event was important for a number of reasons, and I think that's going to be made clear very soon. One of them was the timeliness of it, because the Pahalgam attack happened in April of this year in Kashmir, and then what ensued was a war between India and Pakistan. And the fighting that took place hadn't been to that scale that we had seen for many, many years, actually. Many people in Exeter and in this country, South Asians, were affected by what was happening on a personal level because of having relatives of there or coming from those countries. So we thought it's going to be very contemporary and timely to actually give a bigger or larger context of what is happening in Kashmir, similar to like we did in Palestine, talk about the roots of of settler colonialism and Zionist colonialism in Palestine. Here also we want to do something similar, which is give some people context, people knowledge and awareness about what is behind those events. And one thing I do want to emphasize here is when I'm talking about knowledge about the Kashmir problem, crisis, oppression, injustice, is that there's little awareness, or relatively little awareness, about the issue of Kashmir. I remember growing up, watching the news with my father, and we would watch news about Kashmir, and we would watch news about Palestine. And he would always talk about them as two injustices of similar kind. When he would talk about Kashmir and when he would talk about Palestine, he was also quite an activist. He was an alim, but also an activist in these causes, and doing whatever he can, and he would write about them as well. And it was only when I grew older that I was surprised that a lot of people didn't know what Kashmir was. I mean, Palestine's situation was always dire and really bad, but you could have conversations with people. People knew what was happening. It had media coverage. In fact, it had UN coverage. And people in Pakistan and Kashmir have acknowledged this, that we have even failed to bring awareness about Kashmir at the UN. And one thing, at least, that's been successful with the Palestine cause, I don't mean to understate what we need to do for Palestine in any way whatsoever, by the way, but I'm just trying to draw on some of the statements that I heard from politicians and activists was, at least with Palestine, they were successful at bringing it up at the UN. There was always a US veto, as we know. Action couldn't happen, but it was discussed, it was brought up. It did make the news cycles, whereas the same was not happening for Kashmir. And when I had those conversations growing up at college and university with Arabs, non-Arabs as well, it was difficult because they just couldn't really see what was happening or know what was happening. And that's why I see the work of now Dr. Abdulla Moaswes, I'm going to call him Abdullah, but he just got his PhD on this Monday, actually, had his Viva, in which he successfully defended his PhD on the connection between the two injustices. And I can tell you, he had a great Viva, by the way. I was speaking to Supervisor Ilan Pappé just a couple of days ago, and he's saying, as we expected, Abdullah just cruised his Viva. MashaAllah to him. And all the best for the next steps of his journey. So he's completed a brilliant thesis, as his examiners can bear testimony, and his supervisor. So we're really, really fortunate to have somebody who can speak to both Palestine and Kashmiris of Palestinian origin background, grew up in Sharqa, in Sharjah. And I've got to know Abdullah actually a bit later at my time here in Exeter, but it has been an absolute pleasure. We have conversations for very, very long, and I can see Alia smiling there, probably thinking, why, too long for her good probably. But we do talk for very long about a number of topics, and I've been really, really impressed by his knowledge of especially that part of the world where, he's got enough things to think about when it comes to Palestine and being an activist for that and being an academic and an intellectual regarding that issue. But the fact that he's brought Kashmir into light as well with his research and his work and his activism is really, really brilliant. So he's definitely unique in that sense. And if anyone's got an opportunity to talk more to him whilst he's still in Exeter, I would take that opportunity. We will have question and answers at the end. That was a bit of a kind of unorthodox introduction, Abdullah, but I think it's okay.
No, thank you so much.
Yeah, so it's an absolute pleasure to have Abdullah here as well. I will refer to him as Abdullah, not Dr. Moaswes. It's a pleasure to have him here at the masjid in the second, or perhaps if you want to, informally probably our third of our talks here in the masjid, where we are trying to bring up contemporary issues. And we do thank and appreciate the masjid for giving us this platform. And we thought it's important to do this in the masjid. I mean, these conversations should be happening in our mosques, and it's open to all the community, not only Muslims, and we would like you to get that word out for any other events that we do hold, any ideas that you have in terms of what you think we should be discussing in terms of contemporary issues, crises, injustices. We are trying to bring them up here and tackle them in the masjid, bringing in experts like Dr. Moaswes here. So it's a real pleasure, and I won't take any longer. We will have time for question and answers at the end, once the talk is finished. Bismillah. Shukran. Tafaddal.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mustafa. In the tradition of many uncles at the beginning of talks, can you hear me? Is this working?
Yes, sir.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's really important, I think, to acknowledge at the beginning of every talk that knowledge is rizq, its possession is responsibility, and its provision is a call for action. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to Exeter Mosque for having me, for giving me the space, and for hosting me to talk about this really important topic. It's been sort of like the main thing I've worked on over the last few years. And I think that we're reaching a point in time now as well where the connections between Palestine and Kashmir are becoming much more obvious, more overt, and much more important, and very clearly important to tackle. With that being said, just to give a brief overview of the talk, I'm going to spend most of the talk actually talking about Kashmir, because I benefit from the fact that the previous talk by my colleague Abdullah al-Anjari largely covered the origins of Israeli settler colonialism in Palestine, and then towards the end of the talk, we'll start addressing some of the interconnections between Kashmir and Palestine. And so just to begin, something that I think is really important to do is to situate what we mean by Kashmir. And that's why, as many of you are walking in, you will have seen me fiddling with my laptop, trying frantically to locate a good few maps that I could display to demonstrate this. And so, as you can see on the screen behind me, we have a map here of South Asia, Indian subcontinent, some people call it. You can see, the big sort of nation states of India, of Pakistan, Nepal, of Bangladesh, China, Afghanistan. And here, right in the middle, close to the top, is a region that has dotted lines all around its borders. I'm not sure why there's a solid line over there. That should also be a dotted line, but we'll get to that bit of the map later. That region was once known as the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. And we'll talk about what that means in a moment. Now, specifically, the term Kashmir relates traditionally to the Kashmir Valley, which is sort of like somewhere around there in this map. And it's a valley that kind of is formed by these two mountain ranges. On the sort of southwestern side, the Pir Panjal range, and on the sort of northeastern side, the southern bit of the Himalayas. And in between it, you have this beautiful valley referred to as the Kashmir Valley, with its biggest city being right in the middle, Srinagar. Now, the Kashmir Valley sits in a larger sort of like geopolitical entity that was once referred to as the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. And the princely state's boundaries effectively are this sort of outer boundary that you can see over here. And due to kind of political circumstances that have occurred over the last 2 centuries, further divisions within it came to be formed. And today, sort of like the state of play is that you have this region here in the blue that's under Indian colonization, I would say. And that is the Union territory now called of Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu, of course, is this region to the south of the Kashmir Valley that kind of borders Pakistan on one side and Punjab on the other side, Indian Punjab. Then you have this sort of darker purple region called Ladakh, which was once part of the princely state and is now its own union territory. Over here you have the Aksai Chin, which was part of the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir and is now controlled by China. And here in the green, you have 2 regions, Azad Kashmir over here, Free Kashmir in English, I guess, and Gilgit-Baltistan sort of over here, which often people refer to as the northern areas. Both of these regions fall under Pakistani control. And so this is just to kind of give an overview of what I'm referring to when I talk about these different geographical regions. Now, particularly the term Kashmir often gets used interchangeably with Jammu and Kashmir, and I will do that throughout the talk. But I think it's just a very good idea to have an understanding of what I mean when I say the Kashmir Valley, the Jammu region, and of course Azad Kashmir, which is of course its own kind of important sort of geopolitical entity as well. And with that being said, I'm going to switch the backdrop to this march that's taking place. If I can figure out how to get a full screen while I deliver the rest of the talk. So, where does the modern history of the current sort of Kashmir question arise? A lot of people place it in 1947, of course, with the partition of the subcontinent. But in order to understand the significance of Kashmir's position in relation to the partition of the subcontinent, you actually have to go back a century prior to 1846. When, of course, the British, who a lot of the world's problems start with the British, were participating in a series of wars in South Asia. One of these wars, of course, was with the territory or sort of like the institution that was run by a man called Ranjit Singh, which sort of focused in Punjab. And this was called the Anglo-Sikh War. And actually, there were more than one of them. After the Second Anglo-Sikh War, the British defeat Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And as part of sort of the indemnity of that defeat, he gets forced to relinquish control over Kashmir. The British government then facilitate a sale of Kashmir to a local monarch in the Jammu region called Gulab Singh for 75 lakh rupees under the Treaty of Amritsar in 1846. The value of 75 lakh rupees nowadays is not a lot for such a large amount of land. And I cannot give you an exact number of sort of with inflation taken into account and the currency conversion, what that is worth these days. But a lot of British critics at the time referred to this as a paltry sum. So that payment was made actually to the British and allowed Gulab Singh to take control of Kashmir and some of the surrounding regions. And this was done sort of through a cash payment directly to the East India Company. Now, under Dogra rule, so Gulab Singh was a representative of a dynasty, a political dynasty referred to as the Dogras. And under Dogra rule, people in Kashmir were classified as either Hindu or Muslim. And this kind of followed the tradition actually that the British had set of setting religion as sort of a primary identity marker when it came to ruling different regions. So the Dogras were themselves a Hindu dynasty, and particularly were strong representatives and advocates for the Rajput caste. And we'll come to caste later in a little bit. But what's important to say at this point is that part of the political project that they sought to implement in Kashmir, in this region that now they have recently gained control over, was a process of trying to kind of create a system of extraction and a system of redistribution that privileged the communities that they sought to advocate for or to champion. And so there were really strict rules placed on the Muslims of the Kashmir Valley. There were restrictions placed on things like doing the adhan. But more importantly, I think, there were restrictions placed on the ability to own land. And so land ownership largely became something that was limited only to the Hindus of the region. And I think at this point, it's really important as well for me to say that when we talk about the community of Hindus in Kashmir that kind of are at the center of this kind of like political constellation or configuration, we are referring to a community that nowadays are known as Kashmiri Pandits. And this is not necessarily a communal identity. So the distinction was made on the basis of religion, but historically the Pandit community in Kashmir were a political class. And so when I talk about Kashmiri Pandits, I'm not trying to seek to sort of divide people on the basis of religion, of their religion. And I'm not trying to suggest that there's anything sort of inherent to like these different religious communities that made them act in such a way, but rather that this was a political sort of class system that had been instituted in Jammu and Kashmir that kind of found the religious divide as its primary method of kind of expressing the sort of, you know, privileges and abilities and powers that the different, you know, political and social classes had access to. So the British, of course, were largely fine with this sort of method of trying to dispossess Muslims. But at the same time, you know, they had placed certain limits on what the Dogras were able to do. But ultimately, like, these restrictions didn't address the key issue, which was related to land. And of course, when we talk about colonization and particularly settler colonialism, in a lot of cases, we are talking about matters of land and who has access to the land, who has custodianship over the land, who owns the land, as well as a big question. And so land, of course, is kind of like in many ways the central driver of a lot of what we would call, I guess, conflict, and particularly colonization throughout, you know, sort of modern history, I would say. Now, another thing that was instituted upon the Muslims of Kashmir was a very unfair and restrictive tax regime. And this is really important because at points it starts to get really ridiculous, where there are even taxes levied upon taxes. So to pay a tax, you have to pay another tax. And so this actually becomes really important as we move towards 1947. The Dogras also largely start to treat the region as if it's sort of their personal property, and they paid money for it. And of course, we can kind of go into a whole other tangent about the problems of the idea of money for land. But they largely treated it as if it were their personal family business. So, for example, there's a park, a large sort of like national park, slightly outside Srinagar, called Dachigam National Park. And the name of this park comes from the 10 villages that were depopulated in order to create this park that effectively became the sort of hunting reserve of the Dogra monarchs. Dachigam means 10 villages, for those who are unaware. In the 1920s, a lot of the Kashmiri pundits, in order to kind of preserve their privileges, start to advocate for something called a state subject law. And the main sort of like driver behind this was an emergent trend of Muslim Punjabis migrating to Kashmir, which threatened the Kashmiri pundits' sense of privilege in that region. And so they advocated for this thing called the state subject law, which effectively was a legal tool that allowed the political regime ruling over Kashmir to decide who it recognized as a state subject. This then meant that, for example, only state subjects were able to own land. A lot of employment was only available for state subjects. And this state subject law eventually later on becomes enshrined in the Indian constitution as something called Article 35A, but we'll come to that later.
Shall we?
And so when I talk about the Kashmiri pundits as being a political and social class who also happen to be Hindu Brahmins, it's really important to kind of talk about what that means in sort of like the wider context of South Asia as well. So for those who are unaware, there is this concept, caste, and it's often, I have to say, in a lot of like academic literature, traditionally left out of really important discussions of formations of power in South Asia. And at the top of this sort of like concept of caste that now a lot of people understand as being sort of very ubiquitous, you have a particular caste who are called the Brahmins. And the Kashmiri pundits effectively were the Brahmins of Kashmir. In the many years before 1947, and in sort of the many decades, many of them had actually left Kashmir and migrated to other parts of the subcontinent and formed all these different communities where they actually in many ways still maintained their privilege as being a Brahmin caste. So for example, Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, was himself a Kashmiri Pandit who was raised in Uttar Pradesh. And at a certain point, they reached a sort of political problem, which was that the sort of British rule that had replaced the Mughal Empire previously created sort of a complex administrative environment for Kashmiri Pandits, which effectively gave the community three options for how to proceed in terms of maintaining their privileges. One of these was Anglicization and Westernization, so to start speaking English, to start acting like the British. Another was to reaffirm their Brahmin identity and to start speaking more Sanskrit-focused languages. For those who don't know, by the way, Kashmiri as a language is a very unique language. It's a Dardic language, which we don't have many of in South Asia. And it's very disconnected, actually, from a lot of the languages from mainland India. So this is quite a significant thing to kind of Sanskritize and to start speaking Hindi, or to return to Kashmir. The third of these options at the time was regarded as really impractical, and a lot of historians note as well that Kashmiri Pandits at this point didn't have a particularly strong desire to go back to Kashmir. So the path that becomes pursued actually is to integrate through a reinforcement or through a reaffirmation of their identity as Brahmins. And so I say this largely to kind of root these political divides in sort of like the politics of the time. So there's nothing essential about them, but these were political decisions that were taken by community leaders that entrenched a lot of the divides that come to really characterize the Kashmir question. So this notion of caste is something that Ambedkar, who was a very early opponent of caste in the 20th century, describes as a social class, something called a self-enclosed social class. So it's a social class largely connected to occupations, jobs, that become self-enclosed, to use his terminology, due to the imposition of a closed-door policy towards moving between them. So at a certain point in history, you could be mobile between castes, but at one point, in order to preserve the privileges of the upper castes, that became a closed door, where the Brahmins remain at the top, and then the rest of the structure kind of like follows underneath. So I say this as well to kind of separate, this notion of caste from being like this really ancient concept that, has been never changing for centuries and centuries and millennia. Anyway, so with that all being said and with all of that context being placed, we arrive at 1947. 1947, again, is a really significant year. It's the year in which South Asia becomes partitioned into the two nation states of India and Pakistan. Of course, from our perspective, 1947 is the year before Israel is created as well. And so in many ways, there's already a connection sort of between South Asia and Palestine because they were both under the British Empire. And so, of course, this is a time in which you already had many circulations, people traveling in between the two regions, an affirmation that the Muslims of South Asia and the Muslims of Palestine were facing a connected struggle. And indeed, actually, one of the really interesting kind of studies that I read at one point was about like the awqaf in Jerusalem that were actually created and set up by Indian Muslims, many of which actually remain today. And of course, one of the really important leaders of the Khilafat movement, if anyone wants to talk more about that, they can ask me in the questions. Muhammad Ali Johar is actually buried in Jerusalem, in the Al-Aqsa compound, in fact. Anyhow, so in 1947, by this point, of course, Kashmir had been under Dogra rule for just over a century. A rebellion starts out in a region called Poonch in the spring of 1947. Poonch, actually, I probably should have said this while the maps were up, is a region sort of in between the Kashmir Valley and Jammu city. Sort of on the southern side of the Pir Panjal range, closer towards Jammu. And today, Poonch actually is a really important and really interesting place because it's right on the line of control. So it sits at the border between the region that India controls and the region that Pakistan controls. So a rebellion breaks out in spring 1947 in Poonch, which begins as a situation of civil disobedience by many of the Muslims from the region. Initially kind of starting out as a tax boycott. So I had mentioned already that there were these ridiculous taxes that were levied particularly upon Muslims. And so at one point, Muslim leaders from the region decide we're going to boycott these taxes. And as the year goes on, the violence of the Dogra state in dealing with these protests provokes escalations in the methods adopted by the rebellion. So it starts as a tax boycott, which is a relatively peaceful method of resisting, and it begins to escalate.
It's sad.
And so as there was an awareness that something bad was going to happen to Muslims in the region, this sets in motion a series of events that eventually leads to Kashmir becoming partitioned, as it is today. Sardar Ibrahim Khan, a politician from Poonch and a really important figure within the uprising, arrives in Lahore in August of 1947, so just before the partition, tries to raise awareness and support for the uprising. So when the 14th and 15th of August arrives, of course, these dates are incredibly important because the 14th of August is the Independence Day of Pakistan, and the 15th of August is the Independence Day of India. Kashmir is technically an independent kingdom. It's not part of Pakistan, and it's not part of India. This largely was the result of its fairly unique situation as being a region that had a Muslim majority population and a Hindu ruler. Of course, for those who don't know, the agreement when it came to partitioning India and Pakistan was that Muslim majority regions would go to Pakistan, Hindu majority regions would go to India, and princely states, which was a third type of political configuration, where the British ruled with the help of a local monarch, were allowed to decide who they were going to join. Now, there were only, I think, 3 princely states where the religion of the ruler did not align with the religion of the majority of the population. Of course, Kashmir is the most striking, the one we're talking about right now. But there was also Junagadh, where there was a Muslim ruler and a Hindu population, and the same thing in Hyderabad in the south of India. And we'll come back to them eventually. So by October of 1947, at this point, again, as I said, still there is no decision on where Kashmir was going to go. The Poonch rebellion turns into an armed insurrection. And one of the really insidious narratives that a lot of really pro-India people try to push regarding this armed rebellion was that there was a tribal invasion by different tribes from the Khyber, what we now call the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa region of Pakistan. Back then was the northwest frontier province of the British Empire in India. Sort of arrived to so-called to supposedly invade Kashmir. Now, there is a sense of truth in the fact that people from that region did go to Kashmir to fight against the regime there. But they didn't go there to invade it. They went there to effectively prevent a genocide. Because that was what was on the cards in this moment, a genocide in the Jammu region in particular. So armed individuals took the agency to go and intervene to try and stop a genocide from happening. Now, once this happens, the Maharaja, at this point a guy called Hari Singh, requests support from the newly formed Indian Republic under the rule of Nehru, who we mentioned slightly earlier. And Nehru grants this support on the condition that the Maharaja Hari Singh sign Kashmir off to India. So the king at this point, realizing that his throne is in trouble and there's a possibility of him being overthrown, asks for help, and India approved that help on the basis that he agrees that Kashmir becomes a part of India. So once the Indian forces join the fray to kind of keep the king in power, Pakistan intervenes in an official manner, and there's a war that lasts just over a year that happens after this between India and Pakistan. So the Poonch rebels, under the control of under the command of Sardar Ibrahim Khan, are able to take control of much of the area that eventually becomes Azad Kashmir. So the Pakistan controlled part of Kashmir, and Pakistan and India fight this war that lasts until early 1949, when the UN brokered a ceasefire between the two countries. The terms of the ceasefire, of course, are that the region be demilitarized and that there be a plebiscite, so a vote where the Kashmiris are able to decide whether they want to join India or Pakistan. And the line between the region that was controlled by the rebels and the region that was controlled by India became known as the ceasefire line. Later it became known as the line of control. And it starts to resemble a permanent border between the area under Indian rule and the area under Pakistani rule. And it cuts families off from one another. And it also cuts Kashmir off actually from a lot of its kind of historic trading routes with Central Asia to sort of its north, its west, and its east. Limiting it only to trade with India, with Delhi. And this is really significant as well, that again we will come back to. Now, in amongst the fighting that happens between 1947 and 1949, there is also something that often gets neglected, that people neglect to mention, that kind of gets forgotten within the historical record, which is that there was a genocide actually that took place in Jammu. Jammu was a region that had a Muslim majority, pretty much up until 1947. In fact, a significant Muslim majority. So the percentage of the population that was Muslim was above 60%. And as part of the violence that takes place there, in between kind of the role of the Indian Army and the role of a Hindu nationalist organization called the RSS, the Muslims become a minority within Jammu. And so I think by any definition of genocide, when you go from the majority to the minority within the region, you would consider that a genocide. And a lot of historians, in fact, argue that it was a state-sponsored genocide. So it was an intentional effort to kill a lot of the Muslims of Jammu. The 2011 census, which was the most recent Indian census, lists the Muslim population of Jammu as being 30%, roughly. I would imagine that in 1947, immediately after the genocide, it was probably considerably less than 30%. And so you can see that the Kashmir question effectively becomes born in this sort of like storm of violence. Now, with the other two regions, Junagadh and Hyderabad, something similar also happened, in that there were attempts to overthrow the regimes there, at least in Junagadh. And India actually intervened to ensure that it remains part of India. But what's really, really interesting to point out as well, particularly in reference to the case of Junagadh, which is for those who don't know, a region that's in Gujarat today, that Vallabhbhai Patel, a senior politician within the Indian National Congress, so the same political party as Gandhi and of Nehru, there are some historians who argue that he was actually ready to almost play poker with Junagadh in order to set a precedent for taking Kashmir. So to say that, well, if the Muslim leader of Junagadh decides that he wants to be part of Pakistan, that's fine, because that means that the decision of the ruler is final, and therefore, if the Hindu ruler of Kashmir decides to join India, Pakistan cannot contest that. But what happens in the end is, again, due to the outbreak of violence there, India gains control of Junagadh, and Pakistan make the argument that, well, India gained control of Junagadh, therefore, we must have control of Kashmir. Anyhow, so after 1949, a few things happened that kind of consolidate the situation in Kashmir, and in the Indian colonized part of Kashmir, I would say. There's a political party known as the National Conference who have been around for quite a while, led by a former school teacher called Sheikh Abdullah, who negotiates a form of autonomy for Kashmir under India. Of course, the outcome of the UN brokered agreement is that Kashmir is not part of India. It should have a plebiscite. And the line of control is effectively the border between two spheres of influence rather than the border between two states. And so he negotiates a temporary agreement with Nehru, largely as the result of his friendship with Nehru. And the main outcomes of this negotiation were Article 370 and Article 35A. So I've already mentioned Article 35A, which gave Kashmir the ability to define its own state subjects and limit who can own land there and limit who has access to certain employment opportunities and the certain powers and rights that are granted to a state subject. And of course, Article 370, which kind of outlines the distribution of the responsibilities between India and Kashmir. So Kashmir gets its own flag, which is quite unique for a region under Indian control at the time. And the Maharaja, the king, at this point a guy called Karan Singh, takes the title of Sadr Riyasat, the title of president, while Sheikh Abdullah becomes the prime minister. Now later on, through a whole bunch of legislative reforms, these get downgraded to a governor and a chief minister. But at this point, they almost present as being an independent state. But of course, still under India. And of course, at this, over the ensuing decades, this autonomy gets watered down through a whole bunch of presidential orders and acts of parliament at the level of India. Nehru, of course, sought for India and Kashmir to kind of be even more integrated than what the agreement he negotiated with the National Conference allowed. And Nehru famously at one stage even was said to have said to Sheikh Abdullah, Sheikh Saab, if you delay or avoid closeness with us, we will put chains of gold around your neck. And this, I think, this metaphor of the chains of gold is really interesting because one of the really early ways in which India tries to control Kashmir is through something that the Kashmiri historian Hafsa Kanjwal refers to as the politics of life and the development of a system of aid and dependency. And so rather than by kind of like further militarizing the region, what effectively happens is that India lobbies for Kashmir to accept certain subsidies on certain imported goods. And so this has like really long-standing effects actually on everyday life in Kashmir. So for example, there was a disagreement between the first two chief ministers of Kashmir, Sheikh Abdullah, and the man who succeeded him, a guy called G.M. Bakhshi, where Sheikh Abdullah was known as the father of potatoes because he tried to encourage Kashmiris to eat potatoes because rice being imported from India would develop a sense of dependency on India, and he wanted Kashmir to be relatively autonomous. Whereas his successor, Bakhshi, was referred to as the father of rice because he wanted people to eat rice because he was able to grant a subsidy to make it really cheap, which he thought would make him really popular. Of course, Sheikh Abdullah the reason that he gets removed from power, I didn't include this in my notes, but I should mention, is because at one point Nehru regards him as having too much power within Kashmir. Now, that's not to say that Sheikh Abdullah was actually working towards independence. Sheikh Abdullah was a friend of Nehru's, and their friendship was a very political one. He wanted to have, I would say, more control rather than independence. And so that kind of dominated a lot of his thinking and a lot of his decision making. So effectively, he gets overthrown at a certain point, and India appoint in his place one of his very highly ranking ministers, who kind of agrees to be a bit more of a crony. But Sheikh Abdullah, kind of to consolidate his problematic position within Kashmiri politics, in 1975 gets released from prison as part of something called the Indira Sheikh Accord, which I often refer to as the Kashmiri Oslo Agreement. It allowed him to re-enter Kashmiri politics, but it set very strict boundaries on what Kashmir was allowed to do. And the state's ability to kind of legislate, or the Kashmiri state, I should say, ability to legislate matters that would impact Indian sovereignty. And so in many ways, the way that I think a lot of Palestinians regard the Oslo Agreement as selling us out for a pretend charade of independence or sovereignty, I would argue that this accord that Sheikh Abdullah entered into with Indira Gandhi in 1975 did very much the same thing. So for many years, there are all of these methods of further trying to integrate Kashmir into India. A whole bunch of interventions by the Indian government to be a part of that, a whole bunch of different agreements that get signed between India and Pakistan. That eventually lead in 1987 to a point where there is an allegedly rigged election which allows Farooq Abdullah, the son of Sheikh Abdullah, to come to power. And for a long time, the Indian state had argued against there being a plebiscite in Kashmir, largely because they suggested that, elections can count as a plebiscite. If Kashmiris vote for pro-India politicians, then that means that Kashmiris are in favor of being a part of India. Which, I don't really want to get into why this is an incredibly flawed line of reasoning. A large part of it, of course, because a lot of pro-Pakistan or pro-independence leaders did not partake in elections. But anyway, that is the line that India often used to justify the constant delaying of a plebiscite. So of course, the UN mandated that a plebiscite should happen in 1949. Here we are today, 2025, and we are, I think, farther away from a plebiscite or a referendum in Kashmir than probably we've ever been. So anyway, the 1987 election, which Kashmiris allege was very heavily and clearly rigged in favor of Sheikh Abdullah's son Farooq, begins kind of another process of sprouting the seeds of a rebellion. And in late 1989, there were a series of activities undertaken by Kashmiri liberation fighters that eventually led the Indian government to centrally appoint a bureaucrat from Punjab called Jagmohan Malhotra as the governor. And this leads to large-scale protests breaking out all across the Kashmir Valley, which result in India moving a large amount of armed units into Kashmir, who had previously been involved in fighting against Maoists and against the insurgency in the northeast. So, of course, I think at this point it's important to recall that India's borders since 1947 have always been in question. They've claimed a lot of territory where the populations are not necessarily in agreement with those claims, and they've fought very long and hard counterinsurgency campaigns in those regions. And so this outbreak of violence in Kashmir in late 1989, early 1990 becomes famously known as the Kashmir Intifada. So it happens effectively during kind of the later years of the first Intifada in Palestine, and I believe a Pakistani academic, Hafiz Khan, terms it the Kashmir Intifada, and that name kind of sticks. And so this kind of represents one of the many similarities actually between what happens in Kashmir and what happened in Palestine. Another import from the northeast region of India is something called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA, which expands the powers available to the Indian Army to kill and arrest without warrant, and reduces the responsibility that the armed forces hold when it comes to the process of maintaining order. This is a really important moment because at this point, Kashmir actually becomes the most militarized place on earth. So when I'm talking about large numbers of armed units, we're not talking about thousands of soldiers, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And this is something that in some ways makes Kashmir different to how we understand occupation in Palestine. So in the 1990s, the occupation in the West Bank, for example, starts to become invisibilized. There's an effort to create like a semblance of some sort of Palestinian sovereignty and autonomy, but still obviously under Israeli occupation. There are places where you can go where you can avoid seeing Israeli soldiers. In Kashmir, it's rather the opposite, that the Indian soldier becomes the most ubiquitously cited thing in Kashmir. So if you were in Kashmir at this point, and actually probably until today even, between every soldier and the second soldier, there is a third soldier. Which is a really ridiculous state of being. I had a conversation actually recently with a couple of Kashmiri academics where I cited a figure. It was not one that I had written down somewhere, but I just sort of recalled it from somewhere else that I had heard it, of there being one soldier for every 16 Kashmiri civilians, and they corrected me to say actually the recent number is one soldier for every 8 Kashmiri civilians. So when we're talking as well about a region where people also happen to have large families, that effectively means every family had its own soldier. Which I think I need to say much about how absurd that is. So I don't know how many of us are there in this room right now. I would estimate maybe at like what, 30-ish you'd say, Mustafa?
No, I'd say about 50.
More, 50. So you can imagine us having what, like 8 or 9 armed soldiers with rifles and very heavy weaponry with them. Now, this is the point at which I think it's important for me to kind of pivot towards the Palestine connection. How am I doing for time, actually? I should ask.
A little bit pressed, folks.
A little bit pressed?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
I think people do want to hear this as well.
Sure. Now, like I said, Kashmir's relationship with Palestine starts actually before India and Pakistan gain their independence and before Israel is created. But what makes it really, what I think really kind of like concretizes that connection actually is India's policies in its early years of existence towards Israel. So there is this idea that India was this like really strong anti-colonial, pro-Palestine state, a big champion of the Palestinian cause. And I mean, I don't mean to say that that's completely false, because there were individuals within the different political parties who held that view. But I think one of the most important considerations when it comes to India taking a pro-Palestine line in the early years of its existence was actually to undercut the possibility of support for Pakistan's claim to Kashmir among Arab states and Muslim majority states. In fact, as part of the conversations that happened, or the discussions that happened between India and kind of like the newly born state of Israel, in the late 1940s, Israel's representatives had often been told by India's representatives that a decision on recognizing Israel is not a matter of if, but when. However, the when refers to after the question of Kashmir is resolved. India can't recognize Israel while the question of Kashmir is still in the air, because it would damage India's claim upon Kashmir. Now, again, something that often gets forgotten is the fact that India's recognition of Israel actually occurs in 1950. So it's not that India doesn't have relations with Israel from its birth up until the early 1990s when they normalized their relation. There is a form of a relationship. India recognizes Israel upon the sort of like in the territories that it colonized in 1948, in 1950. When it becomes clear that Kashmir is not going to be resolved very quickly. And a few years later, an Israeli consulate is opened up in Bombay, now I guess called Mumbai, and it's through kind of like these very hushed discussions and circulations that Israel actually adopts, it eventually comes to adopt the policy that it uses to expropriate the homes left by Palestinian refugees and the properties left by Palestinian refugees. Because all three of India, Pakistan, and Israel adopt a type of legislation based on a British piece of legislation called the Trading with the Enemies Act, which kind of governs the legalities through which the state is allowed to expropriate properties. In India and in Israel, these become known as the absentee property law in the case of Israel and Palestine, and the evacuee property law in the case of India. So of course, both the birth of Israel and the birth of the partition of South Asia involved very large migrations of population, which if inevitably leaves behind a very large amount of properties within kind of the territory that they migrated from. And so this relationship between Israel and India actually is a quite close one from very early on. Very much in contravention of kind of the very conventionally understood narrative of Indian support for Palestine. And it's over these decades, kind of between the late 1940s and the early 1990s, that the relationship actually becomes more and more close. But during this time, a lot of these relations, a lot of the discussions that characterize these relations are held in secret. And even at that time, you get like Israeli academics writing about this idea of like a stillborn relationship between India and Israel. So for example, in the late 1960s, Indira Gandhi commissions the creation of the Research and Analysis Wing, RAW. And one of the competencies, or one of the kind of responsibilities rather, that she gives to its head, a guy at the time called R.N. Kao, is to manage a back channel with the Israeli Mossad after the 1967 war. And this back channel eventually, over the coming decades, comes to facilitate, for example, Moshe Dayan's trip to India. It comes to facilitate, Israel's role in supporting India against Pakistan's attempts to kind of gain nuclear capacity. And it comes to facilitate as well the role of Israel in putting down the rebellion in Punjab. The Israeli commandos, of course, trained a lot of the Indian commandos who participated in the raid on the Golden Temple. And so the relationship is largely one that is practiced through these like military relationships. Now in the 1990s, something really drastic happens in Kashmir, which is that some armed Kashmiris kidnap a bunch of Israeli tourists. And this then results in there being kind of a joint diplomatic effort between Israel and India to negotiate for the release of these tourists. Now, the armed Kashmiris who kidnapped them claimed that these were Israeli commandos who were sent to observe the movement of militants in Kashmir. That's a claim that we cannot prove, but that is the allegation made by the resistance fighters in Kashmir. And as a result of like this sort of shared diplomatic exercise or negotiation, a lot of Israeli, a particular Israeli diplomat called Moshe Yeager goes over to India. And as one of the things that he does is that some pro-Israel Indian intellectuals and officials use him being there as an opportunity to try and further build the relationship between India and Israel. So Moshe Yeager goes to see a whole bunch of different former and current government officials. So for example, he does visit R.N. Kao, who at this point is no longer the head of RAW, but is able to kind of converse with him about India-Israel relations. He visits a government official called Naresh Chandra, I think his name is. I have it written down somewhere, but the first name is not coming to me in this moment. And there's a really interesting conversation actually that Moshe Yeager records where he says, where he asks him effectively of his ability to build walls. And he says, yeah, Israel is really good at building walls. We build walls to keep the Palestinians out. We build walls to keep Israelis safe. And so this sort of government official says to him, we have a really long border that we would like help building a wall on. And the actual sort of like mechanics that come into building that wall happen much later, but obviously like several years later, Israel does participate in building like what they call like a smart border or a smart wall in Kashmir through the use of different sort of high-tech instruments. And so over the 1990s, you see that Israel itself also becomes really invested in maintaining Indian control over Kashmir. This is in part a result of the fact that it's a big boost to their economy to have like this big trading partner in India for arms, following a period of financial crisis in the 1980s. But also it kind of shows that like Israeli arms can be used in different contexts as well. India eventually comes to become Israel's biggest purchaser of military technology. So I was looking at the statistics just the other day, and something really interesting that sort of jumped out to me was that I think it was in 2023 that nearly 50% of all arms exported by Israel went to India. So imagine, Israel is one of the largest exporters of military technology in the world. It's one of its most important industries, and half of everything it exports for 1 year, roughly, goes to one country. So, Israel is a country that exports technology to all parts of the world, but half, we have 200 odd countries in the world, half goes to India. And so India becomes, kind of a very reliable partner or a very reliable consumer of Israeli weapons. Now, the question also has to be asked of why does India, decide to go to Israel almost exclusively in a way? They don't actually. So Israel is not India's largest supplier. India is Israel's largest buyer. Historically, India's largest supplier of weapons from of like importing weapons was Russia, the USSR. But of course, after the Soviet Union collapses, it can no longer, like the newly formed state of Russia, can no longer be regarded as a very reliable and steady supplier. And also a lot of their technology starts to become very outdated. And so India starts to kind of like retune its foreign policy to come more in line with, the American camp. And, and of course, the Americans, who welcome kind of like this reorientation of policy, also have a piece of legislation called the Glenn Amendment. Have a piece of legislation called the Glenn Amendment, which effectively mandates the U.S. to sanction countries that have like what we would call illegal nuclear weapons programs. India, of course, being one of them. And so, as a kind of backdoor to access American quality technology without having to, while dealing with the sanctions of the Glenn Amendment, and without having to kind of like disarm its nuclear capabilities, Israel becomes like the ideal partner in that sense. So Israel effectively says, we can give you access to American level technology, no strings attached, without you having to go to the US. Without you having to denuclearize, and so this kind of forms the basis of this kind of like military relationship, or like this military-industrial complex that we see now kind of like manifesting in a very like overt and very acute way. Since I only have a few minutes left, I think it's important to kind of mention a big change that happens in Kashmir in 2019. So in 2019, in August, the beginning of August, there is an announcement from the Indian government that kind of demands that Kashmir be evacuated of tourists, and that a media blackout be imposed upon the whole of Kashmir. And during this moment, with the tourists evacuated and the media blackout being imposed, the Modi government unilaterally revokes, or to use their term, deoperationalizes Article 370 and Article 35A, which effectively means that now non-Kashmiri state subjects are allowed to purchase land in Kashmir, and are allowed to move there and have access to all the privileges of somebody who lives there. Effectively, Kashmir becomes like any other part of India. There are no special rights accorded to Kashmiri state subjects, and the region does not have its own autonomy anymore. And this becomes really important because for a long time, the Kashmiri resistance had been saying that India is going to try to change our demographic balance. You know, they're going to do to us what the Israelis are doing in Palestine. And the thing that was largely stopping that from happening was Article 370 and Article 35A, which ensured that Kashmiris were largely the owners of their own land. Again, coming back, as we began, to the question of land. And now it's been 6 years since that happened, and there have been all kinds of campaigns and kind of diplomatic drives and entrepreneurial drives around the world to encourage foreign investment, foreign as in from India, but also from outside of India, investment into Kashmir to facilitate the process of expropriating Kashmir's land and taking it away from its inhabitants. Of course, Israel also plays a really important role in this, but given that I do not have much time remaining, I will leave that part of things for the Q&A. So with that being said, thank you so much for being here and for listening to me. Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions and to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that enlightening talk, Abdullah, or I should say Dr. Abdulla Moaswes. Little is it known that when we talk about Palestine, we all remember the date 1948, ethnic cleansing of Palestine with the creation of the State of Israel. The ethnic cleansing begins before that, of course. And with Kashmir and the partition of India, we talk about 1947, just a year between them. So there's such close proximity in terms of the chronology of the events and those interconnections. Really, really important. The heavily militarized nature of it, as you mentioned, a soldier to a family almost. It was really shocking information that we've heard and listened to in this talk. And if anyone's been on social media and have seen the comments about Palestine, the amount of irritated comments you get from people coming from India is just extraordinary. People are wondering, why is that happening? And I think you've shed some light on that as well, that why is there such massive, huge Indian propaganda and basically kind of slavery support for Israel. Maybe in the Q&A, more of that will come out. So we'll open up for questions. We have a question what's come through online as well, but we'll take one from the back from here, please. Baha, shukran.
We're trying for the talk, but just wanted to ask you, you mentioned the last movements. I know there's a lot of issues going on in there's a lot of problems in the field because of that. Mention about the Khilafat movement and what impact it could have even in
Sure. Are we doing one question, one answer? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. So I'm talking, when I mentioned the Khilafat movement, I was talking about a movement that existed in kind of like the early 20th century in South Asia. That was largely resultant from the fall of the Ottoman Empire, right? From the fall of the Ottoman Sultanate. I'm not super knowledgeable actually about a lot of the ins and outs of the movement. In fact, probably someone who's more qualified to answer a lot of those questions is the man sitting next to me. Yeah, there was a vision of kind of like a Khilafah being formed from kind of like the embers of the Ottoman Sultanate. And kind of like this movement participated in a lot of like what they called like Islamic congresses at the time. So there were a lot of like meetings of different Muslim, intellectuals and leaders held in different parts of the world. There was very famously in the 1930s one held in Jerusalem. There was one held in Cairo as well at one point, I believe, in Damascus. And interestingly, I mean, the British saw this as a bit of a threat actually at the time. So there is a record somewhere in the Hansard, in the parliamentary like record of a fear of the the kind of like Muslim mobilizations in South Asia in favor of having like a day of solidarity with Palestine and things like that, resulting in a very difficult security situation for the British Empire to manage. Now, I don't want to go too much into kind of like how that movement then sort of peters out, and then kind of like the rise of different Muslim movements in South Asia later on. But my reference to the Khilafat movement was specifically to that movement that existed at that point in time.
Question, just very quickly, the Indian Khilafat is kind of pan-Islamic movement to support the Ottoman Empire when it was on in its last days in India. They also joined up with a non-violent movement in India, which was, of course, supported by Gandhi as well. So it doesn't link to cause of Khilafat today, if that's perhaps where people might be getting mixed up. It was a movement of its own kind at the time. Question here?
Yeah, you mentioned that the British introduced the idea of religion as primary signifier of identity, and I'm kind of interested in the extent to which that changed people's perception of their own identity, how it's their identity.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and I think like in response to that, one of the really significant kind of outcomes of religion being kind of regarded as this primary identifier in South Asia is with the resultant identity politics that ensued. One of the really big trends that emerged from that was Hindu nationalism. Previously, like people did not really, I think, regard themselves as different in that way in South Asia. But with the British kind of like playing power politics by privileging different communities on the basis of their religion, it led to kind of like a sense that there needed to be a unifying force for I guess kind of like this actually kind of vaguely defined definition of a Hindu kind of like in the early 20th century, and so it had a very devastating effect actually upon like just even social relations in the region, much less kind of like the political outcomes that occurred later on, and so. For example, like nowadays, if you watch Bollywood films, maybe I shouldn't talk about Bollywood films in the mosque, but I think it's a really interesting kind of like identifier or rather a really interesting kind of like empirical example, right? Is a few years ago, and I have to say, I watched these films for research purposes. A few years ago, there was a film that came out called Panipat. And it was a retelling of an actual battle that took place between like the Marathas and the Muslims, between I guess the armies of Ahmed Shah Durrani, who were based in Kandahar, and the Marathas who were based kind of close to Maharashtra. That took place in this town Panipat, close to Delhi. And in the film, it kind of tries to paint this image of there being kind of like an alliance between these different sort of like Muslim monarchs in the region around Delhi and the Duranis in Kandahar in Afghanistan, on the basis of them both being Muslim. Now, that never happened. A lot of the alliances that were formed were on the basis of political gain or economic gain, and had very, very, very little to do with the religion of the people who were forming these alliances. But nowadays it's become a very dominant narrative, like in kind of like the state discourse or the state narration of history in South Asia. And so the result of kind of the British using that as the primary identity sort of delineator was, I think quite devastating, and still until today kind of like continues, its legacy is still there in a lot of the politics of today's Indian state. And in fact, a lot of this was, also I should say, because often, people try to make this distinction between the Congress rule and the rule of the Hindu nationalists, the BJP, who are currently in power, by saying that under Congress, the India was secular and things were fine and there was no disagreement between Hindus and Muslims. And everyone was living in this land of milk and honey and all of that. But it's a very nostalgic view of that time in history. Actually, there were a lot of very early sort of movements and practices and decisions that the Congress Party took very early on to clearly enshrine a privilege for those who are identified as Hindus. And in fact, this delineation between Muslim and Hindu effectively becomes the driver for a lot of entrenching a lot of caste oppression, for example, and for kind of maintaining this idea of the privileged castes within India. So a scholar who I enjoy reading, a guy called Dilip Menon, based in South Africa, he wrote a book, I believe in the 90s, where he noticed a trend where every time a concession was made to oppressed caste communities by the government, whereby, for example, they were given, reservations in employment or in education, quotas and things like that, it was always followed by a really heightened case of Hindu-Muslim violence, of communal violence between Hindus and Muslims. And the idea being that, the use of religion as this identity signifier largely also played into maintaining this, caste domination within India. And so this was built into the very foundation of the Indian state, actually, I would argue. The Indian state that emerged in 1947 under the rule of the very secular Nehru and the very peaceful Gandhi. And, of course I use these terms sarcastically. But yeah, I hope that answered the question, or at least kind of provided a little bit more insight into that division.
I'll ask the question that came through online. So everybody can hear it. What can we do right now for Kashmir and Palestine in terms of real action alongside raising awareness? For example, protesting, boycotting, etc. Are there any NGOs and charities you strongly recommend? And are there any local fundraisers? This is the time when we just want to do more to help others.
Thank you to whoever anonymously submitted that question. I appreciate the question. But I think this is a moment that I can take to actually talk about some of the problems that we have as Muslims when it comes to being politically active. Our consumption is not the primary method of us trying to defeat our oppressors. Boycotts are incredibly important, for sure. Donating to charities is important, undoubtedly. But I think it's really important for me to emphasize that, the problem in Palestine and Kashmir is not that Palestinians and Kashmiris are poor or that they're impoverished. It's that they are colonized.
Sure, I understand.
And so I could, of course, make reference to certain charities and certain, NGOs that are helpful in this regard and that do a job in trying to relieve some of the effects of that. But I think it's really important for Muslims to realize that, our wallets and our pockets are really important, and that, yes, we can deal a blow through boycotts, we can deal a blow through divestment and public pressure. But at the same time, we have to recognize that these methods are limited because the problem is not one of poverty, the problem is one of colonization and oppression. And I think there are some really interesting kind of case studies that I can go into to address that. But just to talk about concrete things to do, we all have ability as well to exert political pressure where we are. I really hope that one of the things that I was able to explain during this talk was how different situations of oppression and injustice are interconnected. They're all connected to each other. And of course, it would be ignorant for someone to believe that Palestine and Kashmir are connected to each other, but not connected to our lives over here. I know sometimes we feel Exeter is a bit provincial, it's a bit far, it's a little bit irrelevant in the broader scheme of British politics, but I think that's a really ignorant take. We live in a region where small numbers of people own large amounts of land. So again, going back to the question of land, and we also live in a region that has the highest, I think it's the highest rate of inequality, one of the highest rates of inequality, certainly in the UK outside of London, I would say. is this region over here where you have like, very devastating rural poverty, but we also have, very, very affluent communities and individuals as well living in our midst. And so, it's not a coincidence that, like Britain played a role in the colonization of South Asia and in the colonization of Palestine, and that Britain remains a really important supporter of Israel, and that at the same time, like, its view towards India and to South Asia is one of maintaining the status quo and not of changing it. And so, as people being based over here in the imperial core, like we do have power to, like act politically and act in concert with one another, and to kind of seek out different organizations that can enable us to do that. So for example, in Exeter, we're really fortunate to have a very good PSC chapter, so that's Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And of course, I should also say that sometimes as well as Muslims, we feel that, like we have to be ideologically pure, and so we can't work with people who have relatively minor disagreements with our methods of mobilizing. And I think that's something we have to dispense with, because otherwise we become in danger of becoming an isolated community who then just experience oppression without being able to affect, the response to it and to try and change that. And so while I realize that I didn't mention any particular concrete actions in my response to that question, I'm really grateful for the question, because it opened up an opportunity for kind of me to address some of the problems that we have as a community. And I feel really honored actually to have been able to talk about this here in our mosque in Exeter, which is, I guess, like the biggest meeting point for Muslims in this part of the country. So I guess thank you to whoever asked that.
Great. Okay, please.
I was going to say that, but Mustafa, in your introduction, you touched on the fact that Kashmir doesn't have that kind of attention, for example, to being-led cultures. But I recognize that Israel gets away with a lot because it's a white settler colonial situation. Kashmir isn't. But number one, A, would you agree with that? Number two, how do we get the United Nations to talk about Kashmir in the same capacity that they talk about folks?
Abdullah, that's for you, that one.
That's a great question.
I raised the issue.
I think there's certainly a lot of truth in the fact that Israel gets away with a lot of what it gets away with because it is a white settler colony. But I think beyond it being a white settler colony, it plays a very particular role in maintaining kind of like Western imperial interests in the broader kind of like West Asia region. And I think in many ways, like India's control over Kashmir, over the decades that it kind of entrenches itself, also comes to become quite an important part of the constellation of power in Asia, particularly between India and China. So it's not only, there is an argument to say that, yes, of course, Israel has this kind of unique situation because it is like a white settler colony that emerges in the 20th century as the rest of, like the white settler colonies are retreating, except for the ones that didn't, actually. This is a problem in settler colonial theory, generally, I have to say. But like India's control over Kashmir is very significant as well within that kind of like political economic constellation. It acts as kind of like a blocker in Central Asia for a lot of like movements that could strengthen China, for example. That's a really important part of it. At the same time as well, there is this like military industrial complex as well that, Kashmir is one of its most important sites. So of course, like we talk about kind of like the role of Israel in maintaining that, but actually if you go even deeper into like what does the Israeli military technology industry look like, actually a lot of the companies that form that are companies that are registered in other countries that have a heavy involvement of key Israeli individuals within them. And this is also, in a way, a method of kind of getting around the possibility of, like political pressure and sanctions and different tax regimes. And it's quite a complex constellation of interests, but it ties the Israeli military industrial, the Israeli military technology industry to the interests of a lot of Western states as well. And so these are kind of like just some of the extra dynamics that I guess I didn't refer to in the talk that I probably should have. So I'm grateful for the question. Now, in terms of the UN, I don't know. I mean, this is a moment where like I'm not able to see anymore, You know, like, what can the UN do? You know, like, we talked about, you know, like the fact that South Africa taking Israel to the ICJ on charges of genocide was a trial of Israel, but more than that, it was a trial of international law. It was a trial of the entire system of like collective security in the world to see if, you know, like this system that we came up with after World War II and largely actually after the Holocaust could prevent another genocide. And clearly, I mean, Palestine is not the only example of that failing. You know, like we had others, right? We had Rwanda, we had Kosovo, we had Bosnia. You know, we had many, many others that took place. But I don't know. I mean, like, personally, at my own level, I'm a very strong advocate for trying to build strong, powerful coalitions that go beyond, you know, like the signifier or the identifier of the nation state and its institutions and the institutions it participates in. Not because I have this like romantic idea that like, you know, as an anarchist, all states will fall or anything like that, but because I'm actually not seeing, I'm seeing more actually the dangers of what states can do and perpetrate and perpetuate, more than I'm seeing the benefit of what they can offer in trying to stop genocides and trying to stop colonization. So for example, like, you know, what can a state do without, you know, like, going directly in and intervening militarily in the case of Palestine to stop, you know, what Israel is doing beyond, you know, going to the ICJ or to the UN Security Council or the General Assembly and having, you know, resolutions passed that are not even binding. I don't see what they can do in that regard. The other thing as well is that this system of nation states and collective security that we have actually doesn't even read Palestine's situation correctly. You know, like, it's not someone who I like to cite very often because I actually agree with, I disagree with his argument, but there is a logic in what he says. Norman Finkelstein, very famously, is against, you know, like the use of international law as a framework for arguing for Palestinian liberation because he says international law recognizes Israel. That's true. You know, Francesca Albanese, when she got asked about Israel's right to exist, she said, Israel exists as a state and the world recognizes that, you know? And so, you know, like even trying to go to things, you know, like even this like question of like trying to achieve liberation through this sort of politics has limits because the politics themselves permit Israel's existence as a state and don't properly address the fact that like, you know, history is older than 1948, you know?
Or October the 7th even.
Yeah, and so for example, like sometimes we talk about, you know, like Palestine being the longest running occupation in history. Actually, there are longer ones if you understand the occupation differently. You know, if you try to understand it beyond the framework of international law. So I don't know, I mean, maybe it's please someone ask me something where we can end on a more positive note.
I would say now, there have been Pakistani prime ministers that have raised it at the UN, and in some of those speeches at the UN, they've mentioned Kashmir and Palestine together as one of the same cause in terms of the injustice. But they haven't spoken with one voice when it's come to Kashmir, as they have done with Palestine. But as Abdullah was saying, you know, how effective has that been? I mean, it's been nearly 2 years now. What's good? It's going to be soon. What's happening in Palestine? And for all those speeches and that rhetoric at the UN and elsewhere, it's not brought about any results, just further disheartening really to the situation. So I think what Abdullah's saying is about the same institutions that are responsible for causing this in the first place, or at least having extreme levels of double standards in terms of how they apply the laws that they advocate, means that the kind of activism that's required is got to be much more thoughtful, creative, and outside the boundaries of, I think, international institutions, state structures, and so on. And that's one of the reasons, I guess, why we've gathered here today. But as a starting point, it is about raising the awareness and trying to understand what is actually happening before you can actually do something effectively. I mean, even like writing to politicians, we don't do that in the same ways for Kashmir as we've been doing for Palestine. So I think there's lots of small things that we still can be doing, not completely giving up on the state, but also trying to look at different means and avenues and being a bit more versatile, I think, in our action. Are there any other questions I could have? One here?
You rightly criticised the British in their role in partition, and you suggested that the emphasis on religion was perhaps wrong, and also that criticism was rushed, and that the leadership did not make much of that into as well. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, are there any other sort of lessons to learn in establishing people in their own autonomy from that position?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's a good question. And I mean, I guess the sort of like, if I wanted to be really flippant, the easy answer is don't colonize other people. Um, but the other thing as well is that like at that moment in history as well, there was like a really dominant idea that, and again, this kind of actually refers back to this question about nation states. There was this really dominant idea that like every nation needed a state, and states had to represent relatively homogeneous groups of people. And this was the logic that actually led to kind of like the proposal to, partition South Asia into a Muslim state and a Hindu state. It was also the same logic that led, to the proposal to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. It was also the same logic that led to the proposals to partition Ireland into a Catholic state and a Protestant state. Of course, we can go into the particularities of each case because obviously, like, they're not the same, right? And I'm actually very against kind of like basing too much analysis on parallels. But it does kind of give us an indication into the fact that, hey, this idea of maybe trying to have very homogeneous states might be a bit flawed, And I think, in a way, kind of like, this idea of like history rhyming, right? Like now we're kind of falling into that again, because the dominant discourse here in Britain as well now is that multiculturalism has failed, and like we need to make our borders stronger and higher and make it more difficult for people to come in and try to get people out if we even can, because we need to have a not multicultural, kind of like one nation unified, British state. And I think like the historical example of all of the cases that I've mentioned show that that's a problem.
I should have said the call to prayer is going to happen, and we can just wrap up just after the call to prayer. Finish the answer.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
Yeah, a bit.
I'm you want to finish the question?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, I had finished it. I believe. The one last thing I was going to say was that moving beyond this idea of trying to have these homogenous states, I mean, it you know, like I remember as well when the US invaded Iraq, a lot of academics I know I know in particular one academic who was consulted by the British government very shortly before the invasion said Britain had no idea what they were doing. But then a lot of the outcomes were like, oh, let's solve this by having 3 states in Iraq, a Sunnistan, a Shi'istan, and a Kurdistan. And I thought, you know, like that's again, you know, like a complete mischaracterization of understanding like what sort of things can make people, you know, homogenous or feel solidarity with one another. Kurdistan, I agree with, in a certain kind of, you know, constellation. But Sunnistan and Shi'istan, I think, you know, does not even merit properly going into. But yeah, I mean, you know, like throughout history, communities have had ways of resolving their problems, and I don't necessarily advocate for kind of like a traditionalist approach to problem solving, but definitely we can find something better than the idea of just give them a state, you know?
Yes. Just going to take chair's privilege and ask a question, maybe a follow-up to that one, and we do probably have to be brief because I think we've got 20 minutes for the prayer, yeah. And there's some snacks afterwards, and everyone's got a chance to talk and mingle and ask more things to each other if you want to do that afterwards. You're just talking a little bit about what a kind of state looks like, what a free state looks like. I was going to ask something on Hindutva and RSS, but that might not be time for that. But when we're talking about a free Kashmir, you mentioned, you know, independent Kashmir, Azad Kashmir, and occupied Kashmir. In terms of Palestine, we know various things mentioned, 1 state, 2 state, and so on. You know, what does a binational state? What does a free Kashmir look like? I mean, people might not be aware of, you know, where is Azad Kashmir in the sense of its relation to Pakistan. What does Pakistan want from this? What do Kashmiris want? If you could just give the audience a bit of a picture of what we're looking at for a liberated and completely free Kashmir. Thank you.
I mean, this is a really awkward question for me to answer because I'm not Kashmiri.
Yes. Or for them, what does it look like, let's say?
I mean, you'd have to ask them. And I think this is also part of the problem is that, you know, Palestine at the UN, you know, is seen as a case of military occupation, right? Like there is a Palestine that's represented in the UN. It's a bit of a rubbish representation of Palestine, but it's there. The Kashmiris are not represented in any way whatsoever in international fora. You know, Kashmir is regarded as a territorial dispute between India and Pakistan. And so I think the first step actually is to listen to the Kashmiris and listen to what they want, you know, listen to them speaking. The other thing is that, of course, there are 2, you know, different ideas of what Azadi means in the case of Kashmir. You know, there's a pro-Pakistan camp and there's a pro-independence camp. And Azad Kashmir is called Azad Kashmir, but again, within Azad Kashmir, there are questions on, is Azad Kashmir Azad? You know, are they experiencing Azadi? Are they experiencing freedom? And I'm not going to legislate on that too much because that goes into a whole larger other discussion. But I think the first kind of like, you know, step to take in trying to understand what does a liberated Kashmir look like, and I myself still don't have the answer to that because I don't think that I necessarily should be party to those discussions, is that the first step is to actually listen to Kashmiris, engage with their work, read what they say. There's a lot of great Kashmiri academics and intellectuals out there, a lot of really good Kashmiri organic intellectuals, you know, poets, teachers, you know, people out there.
That's both in Azad Kashmir and occupied.
In both, yes, exactly. And I think the one thing that they all agree on is that, you know, like Indian colonization is not a part of it. You know, that's at least, I think, the one kind of like fun. Of course, there are also pro-India Kashmiris, you know, they, I guess, merit mention to a degree. But they are, I think, a minority and are within a very particular kind of like socioeconomic class in Kashmir as well. But yeah, thanks for the question.
Great. Thank you so much, Abdullah, for that really great talk and informative and hopefully inspiring for us in the sense to take this forward. We don't have really an excuse now that we don't know enough about Kashmir. Of course, there's always more to learn. And hopefully this will be a stepping stone for that to happen. So we will, inshallah, soon, we will ask for your feedback as well. I think you issue a format for those that have registered. So thank you to all those that have registered. Thank you for everyone who's here, especially the wider community that has been present here today. And we will be announcing
And we should plug this event.
the next talk as well. Yes, so this is on...
That's the positive document.
That's the positive note to end on. Thank you.
that we will be meeting again, inshallah, Saturday, 21st June, 12 noon. And it's going to be the same spot, Bedford Square, I guess, Saturday, 21st June. And there was, I think, an important note now. If you can't make it to the march in London, because I think that's the big one, right? That's the national one. So if you can't make it, there'll still be a local march for those that cannot attend. Shukran. Thank you very much.
Thank you.